In the name of God who casts out fear. Amen. Please be seated. Fear is one of the most basic human experiences. We've all been afraid at one point or another. Through a quick Google search earlier this week about what fear is exactly, the word that appeared most often was normal. Fear is normal. We all feel it from time to time. In the gospel lesson today, we hear the Bible's more familiar stories about fear. Jesus has been traveling, teaching, and performing miracles. Along the way, he has accumulated a large following. The closest among them became known as his disciples, and they were with him in the boat. Out in the water, presumably within the safe confines of their boat, their security was suddenly interrupted. A storm came up and tossed the boat around, and the disciples became afraid. They went to find Jesus. In their fear, they sought solace from the one who seemed to have all the answers. To their dismay, however, they found him asleep. In the midst of their fear, as they shuffled around the line between life and death, their Lord, their teacher, their leader, was simply asleep. It was almost a kind of insult to their fear. Jesus' rest went undisturbed. One of the things I like most about this time of year, this ordinary time in the church year, is that it explores some of these normal parts of our existence. And fear is normal. One of the things that can inspire fear most in our hearts is when we encounter those unexpected twists on our journeys. Like a storm that comes up and tosses us even when we thought we were in our secure place. Several summers ago, I went on my day off to see a movie with a friend of mine in Brooklyn. We were actually planning to have a day at the beach, but instead, our one day off turned out to be the one day that it would rain that week. After a week of unrelenting sun and merciless heat, our beach plans were thwarted by storms. Undeterred, however, my friend and I were determined to enjoy our day off together. So we went to see a movie. The movie was terrible, as a matter of fact. I wouldn't recommend it. It was called Prometheus. But as bad as that movie was, there was within it this one line that captured my imagination. And I was reminded of it again as it related to the gospel lesson that we read today. In the movie, a band of space explorers had traveled to a far-off planet on suspicion that another form of intelligent life might be living there. As they approached the planet and were deciding where they should land, one of the scientists on board saw through the window a series of straight lines and grids. He said, "Land there. God doesn't create in straight lines." That line struck me. Even as bad as the rest of the film was, that line kept standing out. Because it is true, isn't it? God doesn't create in straight lines. The shapes are always more complex. There are gentle curves and sharp edges. There are cracks and crags. There are numerous dimensions and directions. But almost never are there truly straight lines. At least not for very long. If you see purely straight lines in creation, almost always it means that your perspective is either too narrow or too broad. Humans, on the other hand, tend to be more comfortable with straight lines. We like to see all that lies before us, as far as we can see. Twists and turns engender fear. They feel unstable. Straight lines make us feel safe and assured. They give us the illusion of control. But of course, as we know, fear is normal. As normal as the odd angles and turns that appear throughout God's creation. God doesn't create in straight lines, and the world and our experiences within it aren't as safe and predictable as we might like. In the church, not just here, but in the church more broadly, we are living in a climate of fear. We have been for a very long time. The straight lines that we thought that we'd built for ourselves and for our futures aren't holding up anymore. The expectations of what church is and should be as it was experienced in the generations before us are proving to be untrue for our time. Some people are even beginning to conclude that those clean and straight paths that we've built for ourselves are keeping us from actually walking with God. Too often we keep trying to walk those same straight lines laid out by our parents and our grandparents, but more and more we're finding that the road we thought we were following just isn't beneath us anymore. And our commitment to predictable straight lines isn't serving us as neatly as we'd expected it to. The world has changed around us, and the same old patterns of moving forward just don't work. When we insist on continuing to walk on those same straight lines, on the paths that we'd imagined for ourselves, we run into walls. Or we find that the path is rocky. Or we find that the goal isn't where we thought it would be. Straight lines may allay our fears, but they don't serve us well for very long. Sooner or later, our short-sighted commitment to them keeps us from following the crooked and unpredictable and often frightening paths that God has laid out for us. After my friend and I finished the movie that day, the rain let up and we went back to his neighborhood bar to have a beer and wait for his wife to get home from work. The little dive bar was packed to overflowing with young people. My friend and I, in our early 30s at the time, were among the oldest people there. They were laughing and reconnecting with their friends. Many of them had their children with them. They were eating and drinking and engaging in real community together. We sat in the outdoor section, and I looked up to my left and I saw my friend's massive old stone church. Just a little farther away and to the right, I looked up and saw the massive old Roman Catholic cathedral. And I realized, maybe for the first time, that those impressive structures don't seem to impress people as much as they used to. Churches are struggling all around because we keep walking along the same straight lines that we've always walked along. We've hardly noticed that the path is no longer beneath us. I know I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, but the truth is, we have to start finding some new path. God doesn't create in straight lines. So the more we insist on sticking to them, sticking to that path that we've always been on, the more assured we are of wandering away from where God would have us be. can be scary to go in a different way. It can feel like the security of the world that we've come to depend on is falling apart around us. But we have to find another way. We have to be willing to try to walk with God, wherever that walk might take us, even when it seems unsure. And not just for the survival of the church, but for the growth of our own spirits. In the end of this story, Jesus restores the calm. The disciples just couldn't take it, couldn't take the instability. But we all know now that the threat of the storm was tiny compared to the challenges and the fears that they would eventually face just for following Jesus. Following Jesus is always a bumpy path. But even so, it is the right path. And it always leads to the right place in time. There will be times when we need calm too. But we have to remember that calm, security, peace, tranquility, whatever else we may be longing for, those aren't the goal. The real goal is to walk with God. And of course, that's not always the easiest path to walk. It usually takes us in directions we couldn't have imagined and almost always wouldn't have chosen for ourselves. But that path, that winding, rolling, unpredictable path, that is the path to which we have been called. And it is the path that brings us closest to God and to God's dream for us. Amen.